It is great to be in a room full of patriots. We're here in Washington at a momentous time. And I mean, of course, the sequester. In honor of the sequester, for each of you who went to dinner last night, your meals were reduced by 2.4%. And I can tell you, I can see the looks of hunger and famine in your eyes. Indeed, I don't know how you're possibly still able to stand on 97.6% of your dinner. And I'll always be haunted by the sight of Newt Gingrich's emaciated face. It's like Anne Hathaway in Les Miserables. Other than sequestration, not much is happening in Washington. It's been pretty quiet. We did have a certain eminence grisée of the Republican Party describe Rand Paul and me as wacko birds. I have to admit, when Rand and I first heard that, we thought maybe that was a new kind of drone. But if standing for liberty and standing for the Constitution makes you a wacko bird, then count me a proud wacko bird. And I think there are more than a few other wacko birds gathered here today. You know, I'm going to tell you the biggest surprise since coming to Washington. People ask, what surprised you when you get there? The biggest surprise has been, frankly, the defeatist attitude among so many Republicans who've been in Washington a long time. I cannot tell you how many times people have wanted to pat me on the head and said, well, that's very nice, you can vote no, and then we'll just lose. It is utterly maddening. So I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret that somehow the mainstream media won't pass on to you. For the last 3 weeks, conservatives have been winning. And we're winning because of you. Let me give 3 specific examples in the last 3 weeks. A couple of weeks ago, I was honored to join my friend Rand Paul as he stood for 13 hours on the floor of the Senate. Now, when Rand started at 11:47 in the morning, there were more than a few senators, Republican senators, who viewed what he was doing as odd and even quixotic. And he stood there alone and said, we are going to stand for liberty. We're going to stand for the Constitution. We are going to stand until this administration acknowledges limits on its power. Earlier that day, Attorney General Eric Holder testified at a Judiciary Committee hearing. And I asked him straight up the question, in your judgment, is it constitutional for the United States government to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil if that individual doesn't pose an imminent threat? His answer was, he said, well, it wouldn't be appropriate. And my response was, General Holder, I'm not asking for your views on propriety. You are the chief legal advisor for the United States of America. What is your view? Does the Department of Justice have a view on whether the Constitution allows our government to kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil? 3 times he responded, it wouldn't be appropriate. It was almost as if he didn't understand the question. And, you know, maybe that says something about how the left views constitutionality, that in their mind, appropriate and constitutional are one and the same. And so his answer, I mean, he really expressed frustration. I told you we're not going to do it. Don't you trust me? And the answer is exactly that. No, we don't trust you. And we don't trust the next guy or the next guy or the next guy, whether he's Democrat or Republican. James Madison observed in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, there are not a whole lot of angels in Washington. And Thomas Jefferson explained the entire purpose of the Constitution is to serve as chains to bind the mischief of government. When Rand stood there alone, something incredible began to happen. First, he received support. Mike Lee and I came early on to support him. Then another senator, then another senator, then another senator. As the night drew on, we saw one after another after another. We saw 20 House members show up on the floor of the Senate. I didn't know they knew where the Senate floor was. And something so powerful happened, which is each of you engaged. It captivated the country as the American people looked at suddenly elected leaders doing something we hadn't seen in a long time, standing for principle. Now, that was actually, the filibuster was the first time in my life that I've ever spoken on the floor of the Senate. And so, to my grave, I will owe Rand Paul a debt of gratitude. That the first time I spoke on the Senate, I had the opportunity to read Travis's letter from the Alamo. And it so happened the day of the filibuster was the 177th anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. So I observed to Rand, who I will note is a native-born Texan, I observed to Rand that if the heroes of the Alamo, if William Barrett Travis and Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie were alive today, they would have been standing shoulder to shoulder with him on the floor of the Senate. I got to read from Shakespeare's St. Crispin's Day speech. And there were more than a few senators who were not there with us that night that have held their manhoods cheapened as a result. I got to read the opening monologue from the great movie Patton. Cleaned up a little bit to make it suitable for television. And I got to read President Ronald Reagan's 1964 A Time for Choosing speech. As they say in the beer commercial, it don't get no better than this. But a second example is sequestration. Sequestration has actually gone into effect. The White House is astonished. All of us remember the President's Scare America tour, where he went all over the country talking about the dramatic consequences. You know, Washington, D.C. is the only place on earth where the phrase draconian 2% cuts can be uttered. And, you know, after a while, I think the President was self-parodying as he described the consequences of a 2% cut in a $3.5 trillion federal budget. It reminded me of, if you remember the scene from Ghostbusters, when Bill Murray is talking about the end of the world, cats and dogs living together. You know, I halfway expected to see the Stay Puft Marshmallow Mans come walking out. But the White House was certain Republicans were going to fold under and cave. And instead we stood our ground and finally got at least the first small step, and I underscore it is a small step, to reining in our uncontrollable spending and debt. And a third example. Last week we voted on an amendment that I authored to repeal funding for Obamacare. Now, I'll confess, a couple of weeks ago, when I said initially I was going to offer this amendment, more than a few of my colleagues were not thrilled. And yet we saw every single Republican in the Senate vote unanimously to defund Obamacare. And the Democrats all stood together and voted to keep imposing the economic costs, the harms, as people are losing their insurance, as employees are being forced to reduce their hours, as insurance premiums are skyrocketing on young people. Every Democrat voted together to maintain Obamacare funding, even if it pushes us into a recession. It's exactly right. But something that hasn't happened in a long time has happened. We're winning right now. So what I want to address with you this evening at the end of this fantastic conference, and boy, I do sure hope one of these days Ann Coulter will learn to speak her mind. If we could get her to come out of that shell, I just have a feeling she'd have some powerful things to say. But what I want to talk about today is the question, how do we keep winning? And I'm going to suggest two very simple steps. Number one, defend the Constitution. And number two, champion growth and opportunity. Defend the Constitution. Liberty is under assault from every direction. Some of y'all may have noticed the Second Amendment is in President Obama and the Senate Democrats' crosshairs right now. But we all did receive helpful advice from Joe Biden. That if you have any threats at home, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun and fire in the air. Which is very, very useful if it so happens that you're being attacked by a flock of geese. Or, for that matter, a drone. So maybe Joe Biden stumbled onto something after all. But you know, this past week, we had a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee where a senior Democrat explained to me that questions about the Constitution have no role in the U.S. Senate. Because, she explained, it's Congress's job to pass laws. And then the Supreme Court interprets them and they can decide whether to throw them out or not. And you know what? That statement is exactly the problem.